when we think about cities, we always think about growth, we think about sites of opportunity. In the current parlance, actually cities are being thought of as growth engines. They are being thought of as what posts for the future, and where, which is like the future of India, the future of world, which is how we think about smart urbanization, etc. Okay. But in many of these things, I think one of the things which is always gets usually neglected is the aspect of sanitation. And if we don't think of sanitation, if we don't think of waste, then actually we are the kind of cost that urbanization is extracting at multiple levels. This is something which is, if one can think about waste heaps, then literally we are creating these heaps, and which also then has repercussions. These are things which cannot be, I mean, usually how cities have dealt with them is by pushing off waste into the periphery. Okay? And I think gradually we are coming to a place, especially in India, where the limits of this pushing into the periphery are being realized more and more, and the costs of neglecting these issues in terms of the toll that they take on health, on quality of life, and even more importantly the overall dignity of labor, all of these are beginning to take a toll, right? And which is why I think sanitation is really a fault line of the city, a fault line which it has pretended doesn't exist in the Indian cities, and something that we have pretended to neglect, invisibilize, not taken into account the various divides of classes, of castes along issues of sanitation. And I think therefore it needs to be understood in a better manner. The current formulations, I think there are many people who talk about Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and I'm bringing that here because it illustrates this fault line to me in a much more explicit kind of a manner. See, Swachh Bharat talks about a people's campaign, and it being a mission, a demand based kind of a approach where people get involved in sanitation, jahan soch wahan shauchalay kind of thing. But on the other hand, it's a very technocratic approach, a managerial approach to sanitation, which completely overlooks the socio-economics of this entire sector. And I think people talk about it as a sector. For me, it has not been a sector. To me, it is an issue which is intimately linked with the overall politics of how a city has come to be, the way a city grows, the way a city oppresses, the way a city exploits, and the way a city exploits not just people but also nature. So it's about the appropriation of resources in a particular way, and therefore I call it a fault line of the city. So if one is to talk about more materially about the entire sanitation as a function, okay, it's a very interesting dimension, because unlike several other functions of linked to urban development, this is one function, this is one sector which is clearly got relegated to the local government, which is the municipalities, municipal corporations, whatever you may call it, okay, but local government per se, okay. And which means that in many ways how this sector functions is like a direct mirror of the state of local government, urban local government in India, right. It is considered as one of the most essential functions of the municipalities. And if you look at it in terms of human power of municipalities, a bulk of it is focused around this, okay. There has been a shift in approaches, okay. There was a period where most municipalities were called as Jhadu Pocha institutions. Jhadu Pocha institutions because basically what you are doing is sanitation. And the idea of that sanitation is focused around public health. Okay, so bringing in this idea itself is also important, because what is meant or what was conventionally understood as public health is basically that you take care of either those living conditions which could be contagious or which can carry disease to different segments of population. Now this is a history behind it, because if cities were spatially divided just like our villages were spatially divided, then the idea was that this keeps diseases away. This proved not to be true in case of diseases like plague, like cholera, which can transcend walls of the city, and therefore public health. So public health to take care of sites which are public, roads, streets. So public health functionaries start from where the private realm ends. Okay, that was the conventional thought. Okay, private constructed in a particular way, public constructed in a particular way. Okay, from there has been a huge movement. Okay, and if one is looking at contemporary discourses around this, then one sees that from becoming jhadu pocha departments, the entire business of sanitation today is seen to be like a techno savvy thing. Okay, so which is full of bringing in multiple engineering technologies. So that's one. The second in terms of shift in terms of technology has been that if in the earlier city the ideal was of a networked city, where you connect the entire city by drainage linkages which are underground or with sewage linkages which are underground, all the waste of the city, even solid waste, collected at one place and then you dump it outside, right. So what you do with that waste later on is not your thought, but it is based also, remember, on a connected system, a networked system. And while in case of solid waste a physical network did not exist, at the same time there was an attempt to develop a network through basically a physical collection of waste from the streets, accumulating it in interim points and then at a city level. So it is a huge collection. A similar approach which is being taken in case of drains and in case of sewerage, right, where you then let it undergo some processing and then you dump it, kind of thing. But that's the thing. So you dump either waste on land where it comes to solid waste, or you dump it in sewage or drain in water, that is either the river or the seas, whichever is closer to you. This is on the technology front. Okay. The second development is in terms of how do you manage. So that technology aspect, from actually employing physical cleaners and therefore the jhadu pocha department, municipalities now consider this as basically a management thing, where you bring in GIS and where you try to develop things where you know exactly where your dumpers are growing and whatever. Okay. But one of the most interesting things in India we find, and in all our cities, that all of these centralized networks first of all have remained dreams. Okay. So which means that centralized networks not only do not serve the they are not present in all parts of the city. Okay. And this is when I say this, even in Mumbai only around 40 to 50% of the city is covered through sewage networks. Okay. So the rest doesn't have sewage networks, and I am talking of this spatially, and this about a municipality which is extremely rich like the Bombay Municipal Corporation. In case of several other cities, the stretch of sewage networks is not even 10%, which means 90% of cities are uncovered by sewage. Okay. The second complexity that has actually arisen is the fact that basically this divide that is there between the served and the non-served actually increases even more when it comes to the poor population and especially slums. Okay. With respect to slums, let me take one step back and say that When it comes to areas which are unserved but which are non-poor, there has been an emphasis on developing decentralized solutions. Like you have small STPs, sewage treatment plants, or you will have septic tanks, etc. Okay. When it comes to slums, the emphasis has always been slums are considered to be a afterthought. They are illegitimate, they are encroachments, they are illegal. So when you provide services to them, the services are not thought of as a full service coverage at all. So even in terms of a conceptualization of the service, there is only like a half thought which is given, and this half thought or quarter thought or whatever may be seen expresses itself in multiple ways, and I can speak at some length with these kind of examples of how there are quarter thoughts which are given. Okay. So one, I think, is in terms of how do you look at on-site. First, you only think of on-site solutions. Okay. So waste from the slums, even if there are sewerage lines which are present, okay, you do not think of connecting sewerage from the slums to other sewer lines in the city. I remember a friend of mine who worked on a sanitation project in Sangli, and she faced tremendous, she did a mapping of all the slums and discovered that most of the slums in Sangli were actually located on sewer lines. Okay. So it was easily possible to construct individual toilets, it was easily possible to connect all of these individual toilets to sewer lines, and yet the municipal corporation was extremely unwilling to let these individual toilets be constructed and let them be connected to sewer lines. And that is because basically one would like to perpetuate perhaps a culture where the slums are perennially dependent on a political patronage and on-site solutions. Okay. So this is one example of a half thought or quarter thought. You always conceptualize slum people as not having any agency at all, and therefore being able to contribute to these kind of services. Okay. You would like to keep them dependent and perhaps then have free services, because free service enables you to keep them dependent and impose your conditions on them. A second example that I will give of this quarter thought is also in terms of the number of toilets that you construct, and you pretend adequacy about these. Okay. I was involved in a program called the Slum Sanitation Program, which was initiated by the World Bank in Mumbai. And while doing some of these studies linked to the slum sanitation program, discovered that basically in provision of toilets, there is a ratio which is assumed of one toilet seat per 50 persons. Okay. So 50 persons use a toilet seat, and then subsequently now these ratios have been brought down to one toilet seats for 15 persons. Okay. So that itself, I think, is a revolution for policy per se. But when you talk about 15 persons, we have done studies in toilets which tell us that there is a single toilet seat which often has to be shared by as many as 256 people. That is the kind of extent of shortage of toilets. Okay. Now what happens as a result? I mean, I am trying to make some easy calculations here, but for 256 people, even if you save 5 minutes per person, that results in some 1200 kind of minutes, 1200, a little less than 1200, but around 1200 minutes, which means around 20 hours. And if that is the waiting time that we are talking about, I think it easily explains for us why we see so much of open defecation around. Okay. But if that is the kind of waiting time that we are talking about, it explains to us how easily there are people who are excluded just from the use of toilets. That we have not just covered a full demand of toilets. The people who are getting excluded the most, I think, are children, because who will allow them to stand in queue for such a long time, and especially when you're talking of morning rush hours, etc. Okay. So I think our conceptualization of open defecation, our conceptualization of what level of services do we actually provide to people who are poor, the terms of provisions of those services, I think all of that requires a critical rethink, and I think we begin to see how these quarter thoughts are given. When it comes to collection of solid waste or collection of waste, I think this becomes a even bigger divide. Our national statistics tell us that basically that it is the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and to a certain extent other backward castes who form the bulk of the population in slums. Okay. The most marginalized of these groups are also involved in waste collection, and all the occupations linked to waste collection, whether in the formal sector, which is the municipality, the state sector, or whether in the informal sector as informal rack pickers and waste pickers and so on and so forth. Okay. Or even in terms of other occupations which are linked to waste. So there are many of these. For example, there is halal khori, which is around the identification and tapping and killing of rats, the entire pest population, pesticides and regulation of that. It is linked to the cleaning of drains, cleaning of nalas, and each of these frontline occupations, if one traces, then one will see that the proportion of scheduled castes is, and especially the traditional castes who were engaged with waste, that is the maximum population. Okay. Another levels of studies also indicate to us that if you look at generation of waste, then that differs as per class, and that you will really see that the people who come from the elite sections generate a maximum amount of waste, and it is the poor who generate the least amount of waste, because they would try to reuse and recycle to the maximum kind of extent. Okay. And with all of this, one of the most depressing things is perhaps with our definitions of public health, it is these populations, okay, who are dealing with waste and cleaning, actually not just dealing with waste, they are involved in cleaning, and they are cleaning up the waste which has been maximally generated by non-poor sections of the city. Okay. And yet it is these populations who are the most unserved when it comes to not only these toilet examples which I have given earlier, but also when it comes to waste collection. Because the city says and defines public health, that public health starts with the streets, and which means that solid waste collection does not begin within the slum, but it begins only from some defined point of collection which would be near the road for the slum. Okay. You do not contemplate household collection of waste at all, and there are therefore different municipalities have started in the current times, in the last 10 years or so, they have started designing schemes for the collection of waste from slums, which are largely privatization based schemes. Okay. They are given the name of community participation, they are given the name of community management, adoption, but I think if you begin to translate the brickbats of what is actually being done, then you are basically saying that the municipalities are not going to take responsibility of waste collection in slums. It is going to be left to contractors which can carry multiple names, NGO, CBO, whatever, but they are going to be contractors. They are in turn going to employ employees on a very, very uncertain and unfair wages. Okay. And you create conditions of dependencies where people in slums have to pay much more. Okay. So in short, what we perpetuate through these kind of practices is people who are engaged in cleaning practices perhaps have to live with the waste the most. They have to pay for collection of waste the most. And then to top it all off, they are seen to be responsible for making the city dirty. They are the unswachh part of Swachh Bharat. Okay? And then the city goes about in a mission of cleaning up the city, thinking that it is these people who are responsible for dirtying the city. It is slums who are the dirty part. It is these castes who are the dirty part. Rather, I think where we have to really do a complete about turn and reverse these realities so that we begin to think of and bring into center stage issues of dignity of labor, issues of caste exploitation, issues of spatial equity and service equities across sections of society, and rethink this dialogue. So I am not opposed to decentralized solutions. It may be possible that environmentally just collecting all the waste of city and dumping it on land or dumping it in the waters is not a sustainable option at all. But if it has to be decentralized waste management, then the entire city has to be part of that decentralized waste management. You cannot have different service levels, different service norms for different sections of people. I think unless we reconstruct this entire discourse around waste and around sanitation, I think there will not only be no Swachh Bharat, but I very clearly doubt whether we will even have any smart city which actually emerges at all. Okay? A city which does not know how to manage its waste, a city which does not know how to manage its waste equitably is increasingly, I think the paths of urbanization that we will be carving are going to be more and more unjust, and it will be more and more violent, and there creates multiple contestations. I think just contemporarily in the city, in our country itself, there are so many agitations around multiple places where Gram Panchayats are refusing to give their land for dumping grounds for cities. This has happened in Pune, this has happened in Thiruvananthapuram, this has happened in Mumbai, the outskirts of Mumbai, where there are new dumping grounds which are being sought. Okay? So it is creating those kind of clashes. There are other kinds of clashes which are where the entire thing of sanitation and sanitary responsibility being passed on to particular castes is being resisted tremendously by sections on which this is being imposed, and rightfully it should be, right? Because none of us are actually questioning the entire divide between the public and the private at all. So our private spaces, and for most middle classes and elite classes, are actually being cleaned by people, or I would say slaves who work for these people, and then we call them dirty. So people who clean are actually called dirty, and if that's the way in which we are going to construct Swachhata, if that's the way in which we are going to create smartness, then there is no way in which we will lead forward to becoming smart. Finally, I will also say that our approach in terms of technology, it has to be a mixture of the jhadu pocha as well as the techno savviness, because what we are also seeing in certain municipalities, especially is that the number of workers on ground is being reduced, and if number of workers on ground is being reduced, then there is no way a city can be clean at all, and that's not the way it can be constructed.